Hello and welcome back to Exploring the Spectrum. Today with us we have Dena Gassner, who is a senior research scientist at Drexel University's A.J. Drexel Autism Institute in the Social Connections and Treatment Lab. Her career began as an outcome of having to develop extraordinary skills to navigate systems for her son Patrick, who is also an autistic adult. His diagnosis and her work to understand led to her own diagnosis after years of medical gaslighting and maltreatment. Welcome to the podcast, Dena.
Nice to be here, Julia. Nice to see you again.
Likewise, I was so excited when you agreed to chat with me, and I heard you speak on a number of other podcasts, and I think your perspectives are extremely valuable, not just for people trying to navigate the systems that exist, but also people trying to figure out how to advocate for themselves and understand themselves after a diagnosis. So, to start, can you share a little bit more about how you came to do the work that you do?
So I have this glorious young man in my life, my son Patrick, who is now 37 years old. It's hard for me to imagine that I have my youngest is that old. And he was diagnosed very early on. He met the stereotype of what people are looking for when they think about autism. And so he was uh, just, I won't say he experienced any regression, but he experienced an inordinately effortful and slow progression in his development. So he was late in personal care skills. He had global learning disabilities and processing differences. He had extraordinary sensory needs. And so his autism was external enough. You'll hear me talk about internalizing and externalizing autism today because I think assigning support levels is less informative than describing that autism either manifests in a way that other people can subjectively see, or it may manifest in a way that's internalized. And so I was an internalizer, so much so that I didn't get a diagnosis until 40. He was more external in his manifestation, so he got that early age 3 diagnosis. But unfortunately, even at age 3, he missed out on early intervention. He did go to Head Start for a developmental preschool program. Um, he did a summer camp that taught him how to use technology, but we didn't do ABA. I had a lot of shame as a parent that we couldn't afford ABA back in the day. But now looking at my son's he's just a sweet soul. He's very tender, and I'm grateful now retrospectively that we weren't able to do ABA in its earliest iterations, because now of course we've learned how harmful it can be. And I think if we had utilized the earliest iterations of that, the more Skinner based protocols, that it would have done great harm for him. But, I insisted that he was happy and included. My goal was for him to be in the mainstream classroom. And my theory at the time, under his misdiagnosis of intellectual disability and classic autism, was if he's in a room where they're not doing any academics, he doesn't have any chance of passing a GED or, maybe graduating high school at 21 instead of 18, for example, to get those academics in. And we wanted to give him every opportunity to succeed. What we wouldn't find out until well into middle school is that he did not have an intellectual disability. He had extreme expressive language issues and word finding problems. And so much of the testing involved these open-ended questions that were too abstract or not specific enough, or he was unable to find the words to answer the questions. It wasn't that he didn't know the answers. It was the formatting of everything that interfered with his ability to express how smart he really is. So we just kept opening doors and he kept going through, and we didn't expect him to achieve any of the things that he's achieved based on the diagnosis we received early on. But of course, he's a superstar. He just kept persevering and persisting, and I kept doing everything I could to get him as much support as I possibly could. And he went on to graduate with honors from high school, and he went on to get his bachelor's degree from Marshall University. Unfortunately, the system after that, as we all know, is the cliff, the services cliff, and he's volunteering in a museum, and he's not working, which he should be, and he doesn't have much community engagement, but I can't be a full-time scientist and be his primary caregiver anymore. It's just too much to juggle. So currently he's floating between my husband's house in Cincinnati and my address in Philadelphia. And he's happy. He doesn't have any co-occurring mental health issues, just some situational anxiety, but he's doing very, very well.
And I remember you sharing that it was a therapist who chose a different approach that really made a difference in unveiling the kid that was actually underneath this label of learning disability.
Yeah, what we found out is that, if you gave Patrick a grade level content where all of it was open-ended questions, he would get about a 70, 65 average on that test. If you gave him the same grade level content but didn't add the burden of that additional word finding process. So, in other words, if you converted it to multiple choice, fill in the blank, using a word bank, he would do far better, and be more successful, and his grade would jump up to a 90 or a 95. So it was just a matter of working around that expressive language impairment, but he was absorbing everything. And so they had massively underestimated him, neglected him, underserved him. But because he was fully included, he was hearing all the grade level content. And so when we did finally get him in a school by around the ninth grade that knew he was capable, the kiddo just took off. And so I'm very proud of his accomplishments. I would not describe him as having what we used to refer to as an Asperger profile. He's still um, uh, I would say moderately impacted, and he needs help with money management, medical care, decision making, and just general support in those areas. He has a lot of anxiety about medical practices. But other than that, he does really well. And he has lived on his own in his own apartment with a little bit of support. So when I envision what support would look like for him, after we're not here anymore, I would think that he has 3 sisters, 4 if you count his sister-in-law. And so, those girls kinda have it taken care of, I think, within them. We're gonna set up a trust on the house so he has a place to live. We just have to figure out where he's gonna land because my daughter doesn't live where my husband lives or where I live, and so there may be another relocation in our future. But I think that, we're talking about a housekeeper once a month and, going to the supermarket with his sister and doing his own shopping and just having someone to help him make choices, and understand his choices. We have never made decisions for Patrick. We've always done decision making as developmentally appropriate collaboratively with him. But we do find because of his language processing issues, people tend to talk over him. And so quite often we have to translate or we have to build in space to be sure that he's being heard, but he has achieved far more than we ever were projected to have been able to see in him.
And the what you just described is very much focused on what's best for Patrick. And a lot of times parents project onto their kids autism or no autism, just in general, the things that they wish for their kid to achieve or experience. What allowed you to really approach this from a Patrick lens? Was there things in your experience? Was it something you've learned along the way?
Well, I think part of it is that, even before I had a diagnosis, Patrick and I had a different kind of connection than I experienced with my oldest, who is now 40, my daughter. My daughter is neurodivergent, but in a very different way. She's dual brain. She has brilliant language capacity and she's a terrific writer. And she's a great artist. So she's very interesting in the way her neurology expresses itself. She leans a little into the anxiety OCD profile that we often see in the shadows of an autism diagnosis in a family. But all of those things have been relative strengths for her, in that she's capitalized on it. And now she works in communication. She's a great graphics designer, you need language, and you need vision to do that, artistic vision. And so she's quite successful in a very different way. Patrick, I don't know. It's almost like we were like on the same wavelength. So when he would get overwhelmed and overstimulated in a setting, we just pulled him out of the setting. We didn't second guess how badly he needed it. With rare exceptions, as it related to medical care, we did not force anything. So he did therapeutic swimming. We wanted to make sure he was water safe because of the high frequency of water-based injuries and unfortunately deaths that happen in autism. We did therapeutic horseback riding. He was the hydration consultant for the ice hockey team, which gave him community in high school. And on the occasions we had bad experiences, like we went to do soccer, disability soccer, and we were just practicing kicking the ball in the yard. What we didn't inform him of is that people were going to fight him for the ball. And so he said, it's not fair. They don't take turns. Uh,
Oh.
and so we didn't go back. It was just too frustrating for him. And so I think that if we did anything right and maybe we stumbled through it and we were just fortunate, we listened to him, I think is what it comes down to. And the other thing that I can't, as a scientist, like part of me is proud mom, but part of me is a scientist that's going, wait a minute. How did somebody who was predicted to never achieve anything with his life able to have the resilience, the persistence, and the intrinsic motivation to learn? That fascinates me. So that's what I hope I get to spend the next 10 years looking into is, what creates this kind of impassioned drive for some of the people in our community.
And one thing, as I read more and more and I explore, one thing that I hear often is these autistic children, autistic adults, if they're around people who believe in them, they're much more likely to exhibit that resilience. Did you ever see like a pivotal shift, a moment where you experienced that in real time?
I think one of the biggest pivotal moments was we had relocated a couple of times to try to find a school district that could meet his needs. So I waited until my daughter left for college so she wouldn't feel too abandoned, although I think she felt a little bit. And then my son and I left my husband in Cincinnati where the job was. And he and I first relocated to North Carolina, which was worse than any place I'd ever been in terms of services. It was a nightmare. Um, they actually promoted him from seventh grade to ninth grade and then just hands off watched him fail. And so that was probably the darkest period of our journey together. But then we did move just south of Nashville. Um, I had gone to a professional development training when he was probably 7 or 8 and had experienced a gentleman who ran a school district there. He had disabled kids he'd adopted, and he took parents to due process to force them to include their kids. He had a very different mindset about inclusion practices, um, and he had since left the district. People who are too innovative sometimes don't last, but the implications of his influence were still there. And so, as a last ditch effort, because we couldn't find anything in Northern Kentucky or Cincinnati where he was, um, we moved there, and he flourished. And, in the previous school, for example, I went to do an observation and he was seated facing away from the teacher every day, as compared to this school district where after a week they had him write about something that had happened to him. He had to dictate his work because he can keyboard 32 words a minute when he copies, but he can't produce language and keyboard simultaneously. So he dictated this document where he said, he talked about the negative experiences. He had been harassed by teachers. He'd been stalked by a teacher. He'd been isolated by 2 teachers in North Carolina. It was a real human rights violation. So he talked about that terrible trauma, but then he said, but now I'm in my high school, and now everybody here is nice, even the ladies in the cafeteria. and that's where I knew the pivotal moment had happened. We'd turned the corner.
Wow. And at this point, had you already received your diagnosis?
When we were in Nashville, I was in the process of attempting to secure Social Security disability. I had gotten my diagnosis, but I found that I was unable to provide the caregiver services he needed in terms of navigating these systems and fighting for everything tooth and nail. I just, it was too mentally and emotionally exhausting for me to work full time and juggle all of those systems for him. For a brief moment while I was in Nashville, I guess about 7 or 8 years, while we were there, I did help other families with some school advocacy, and I developed this expertise around how to get through Social Security more expeditiously. And so I was translating that in the community. Now at Drexel, what I'm doing is I'm securing a grant so that we can train people to do what I learned to do. And so I was in the throes of sort of getting my head around my own diagnosis while he was in Nashville. But it was a very supportive community. There were two mothers groups there that were out of this world. One was a group that met in a coffee shop on a weekday morning, and people basically cried in their coffee. But the other group, which I created, was called Margarita Moms. And my goal was to create a girlfriend network for mothers who had kids with differences that had lost their old friends that just didn't understand our lifestyle and the unpredictability of things, and they required too much of us. This group just got together when we could. No harm, no foul. If you have a bad day, we went to see Magic Mike and a hot tub time machine and all these crazy things. But we went out and we just enjoyed each other's company, and it was a healing balm, I think, to a lot of the women there. But, Patrick graduated, that was beautiful, he had a wonderful high school experience, um, but, then he went to Marshall, and we were struggling to find the tutor that he needed, so I went to Marshall with him for 2 years until we got him set up, and once that program plugged in, I was able to pull back, and I went back to finish my PhD, so
And
and by the way, I wanna just say this, you asked me about and, I'm still integrating my diagnosis. I think Patrick and people of his generation, many of them have been fortunate to have parents who gave them language to describe their experience, helped them to understand what words will give them the support they need, as compared to people who get late diagnosed and then they have to unpack all that trauma and they have to know, not, I say comes in 3 stages. What is autism? And you have to examine, which I think that's what you're describing, Julia, exploring, an array of lived experiences of autism to pick and choose what applies to you. And then you have to know what autism is, then you have to know how you experience the world differently through the lens of autism. You know, I experience the world differently if I have to work under fluorescent lights. It totally screws up my nervous system. And then you have to know how to convey that to people because what they see and what you experience, there's often a gap there. And so accommodations, modifications, disclosure statements close the gap between what you're experiencing and what people perceive. And that's not something that happens overnight. And it's a lifelong journey. The more I experience other people's lived experiences, the more I understand myself.
that's a powerful statement. And it makes me think of what you said in the beginning, this labeling of support needs. You have the internalizing versus the externalizing. For you, what were some of the things that shifted after the diagnosis? Because I imagine there was a lot of things growing up, experiencing life, not knowing that you're experiencing it through a different lens, created an internal narrative about what you can do, what you can't do, comparing to others. So, what shifted for you in maybe stage two of how you experience things differently?
Well, I did experience early childhood sexual abuse. And in that process, because the individual who was the other party withheld all attention unless it was this inappropriate attention, it was the only way I knew how to socially communicate. And I was aware that I enjoyed the attention it got me, but I was unaware of how contorted that was. I was unaware of how I was using it as a masking strategy. And then what would happen is that would set me up to get into vulnerable situations. So as a result of that, I experienced more than one experience with date rape, because I had gotten myself in the situation. We're socially groomed to believe, all women are groomed to believe that if they experience unwanted attention, somehow they deserved it. Um, and I really had not developed any other means to engage with people other than being outrageous and attention seeking. And so it did a lot of harm. It did a lot of harm. And I had also been groomed to repress a lot of my needs. So I was, gosh, in my mid 40s before I realized that my mood swings and my emotional lability were triggered by lighting. Who knew, you know? Um, and that if I can protect myself from that kind of invasive lighting, I can be productive, articulate, emotionally regulated. I don't weep, but I'll give you an example. I went to DC for an appointed advisory group, and they changed the meeting room. And the first meeting I attended, I was on my game. It's very politically charged and very intense and very intellectually stimulating, but demanding at the same time. I would arrive a day early and leave a day late to give myself recovery time from the demands of the meetings. And the second meeting, they put us in a different room with the kind of lighting that triggers me. And by noon, I was like melting down and weeping in the hallway. And I'll point out that the difference between internalizing and externalizing is when you internalize most of your life. I'm not talking about masking. I'm just talking about being relatively stable in most domains of your life. When you have that bad moment, people don't think of autism. They think of a personality trait. They think of it as a character flaw. And in the throes of me having my version of a meltdown, which was just silently weeping in the corner, only one of my autistic colleagues clocked it. And another colleague of mine from the committee said, well, this doesn't sound like her. She doesn't behave like this. But at no point did anyone say, are you okay? That's a big difference. That's a big difference. If I had been flapping my arms and pacing the hallways in that environment, I think people would have been more empathic, because they're used to that more externalizing expression. But when it expresses like a huge mood swing, you know, no, no empathy, no support. And what devastated me about it is that there were so many people in that room who should have known better and who knew me, who knew my character, nothing.
I clearly am at a loss for words. I mean, it's almost like because of the cultural narrative, the Rain Man, um, like with Rain Man being the person that people think of when they think of an adult with autism, it's like for the people who are able to regulate well enough to not have these stereotypical external behaviors, they actually sometimes suffer more because the narrative hasn't caught up to pay attention to all the ways that a meltdown or nervous system shutdown can manifest.
Exactly, exactly. And in addition to that, the pressure to maintain that is intense. I'm not allowed to have those experiences. And the other thing is, I think of, many autistic people, we talk about the extreme in cognitive processing. So they can be very language driven. And that was one of the big myths that we're still trying to break through is the idea that everybody's a picture thinker, right? One very famous picture thinker told everybody that all autistic people are picture thinkers. I can't read a map to save my life. I've never been a picture thinker. In fact, when you say the word policeman, I see letters before I see an image in my head, right? So, all to say, because of the way we process differently, because my relative strength is this highly developed echolalia. You've only spoken with me offline one other time, but you can hear me being repetitive and using some of the same phrases or descriptions. It's actually echolalia, but because it looks spontaneous, and I've learned through musical theater and speech classes how to deliver it. People don't know how repetitive it is unless they spend time elbow to elbow with me for an extended period of time. And then it's kind of comical. I'll go into a situation with a colleague of mine and I'll start down one of my spiels and she'll just go, okay, I'm going to go over here now for a minute because she's heard it before identically, right? But, it takes a lot of exposure to me to pick up on those nuances. And my relative strength is language. I can absorb massive amounts of communicative language, and yet I'm really impaired. I can't balance my checkbook. Very, very impaired in mathematics. And so, because my strength is spoken language, people forget that I'm autistic. It creates a cognitive dissonance that they just can't seem to get past. So when I have a meltdown, they apply that same dissonance to, she should know better. She should be able to handle herself. She shouldn't have come in this room and yelled at us for eating in the quiet room, which is what happened at the event. But, I was not in my right state of being. I was completely offloaded. The meltdown was recoverable. The ostracization that I experienced from my other colleagues, the lack of empathy and support, was decimating. Still recovering from that.
When you talk about stage 3, how to convey your experience to other people, I imagine in this moment, there wasn't a chance to convey that ahead of time. This was all happening in real time, and then the aftermath that you're still dealing with. So, for people who have gone through stage 1, they understand what autism is, they've gone through stage 2, they understand what it means for them. What would you say to help these people then figure out how to translate that to the world, realizing that they wouldn't always be able to predict one situation or another?
Well, from working with the Social Security work, one of the things I tell people to do before they apply is to sit down and draw a T chart. And on one side, write down how autism expresses itself in people of, their birth, their assigned birth, just because it's very, very different from person to person. And then to write down how they experience those challenges, right? So, for example, maybe the DSM says people with autism often have unusual responses to sensory information. Then, as a provider, I would sit with that person and talk about some examples of that. I'd say, well, some people are really sensitive to light. Some people have hyperacute hearing. Some people can't process background and foreground noise. Some people can't wear certain clothing or the tags bother them. And what you start seeing is them going, oh, that's autism? I thought I was just weird, or whatever word they've been groomed to use to describe themselves. And so by kind of going back and forth with what is autism, how do I experience that? For the first time, they walk away with a document that begins the process of unearthing their authentic selves, right? Really understanding themselves. Before that, I feel that people are free falling. They're just just falling through life, stumbling, doing the best they can. They don't know that they're disabled. They don't know that they're entitled to accommodations. They don't have anything on the whiteboard in their head to think about what things might be helpful. I'll never forget this. I had a client that I worked with who'd gone to school. She became a nurse. She didn't do well in nursing because of a lot of competing demands that are not aligned with autism, but her dad was a doctor and he thought nursing would be a safe place for her. And so the first time I met her, she did not want to be with me. She didn't want to be in this situation. She thought it was just another provider, right? Like she'd been through. And we were in a restaurant meeting because I didn't have an office set up yet. And we sat down and and the parents started talking. And I go, "Can you give me just a second?" And I took a napkin and I unscrewed the light bulb over the booth. And she looked at me like she'd finally met someone from her planet. She's like, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Because the light bothers me." She goes, "You can do that?" She was in her mid-30s. But she didn't know that light bothered her, and she didn't know that she was able to do that, you know? And so that's the process, right? Is some people are really sensitive to lighting. These are the kinds of accommodations you can get if you have a lighting problem, right? They don't have that connectivity of this is my diagnosis, this is how my diagnosis expresses myself. And because of these expressions of my diagnosis, these are the kinds of accommodations that I can use to bridge the gap in my productivity, right? And so we talk all the time about the need for intensive early intervention. We are not designing anything for intensive late intervention. And our community suffers needlessly because we don't know how to prepare providers to walk people through that journey. And I do think too that I've experienced situations where parents or spouses will say, "Well, now we know they're autistic, just fix them." And so we need to help them understand that this is an iterative process. Somebody said, "Well, autistic people like to spend things." I go, "I don't think I ever did that." And then I remembered, like back in the late 60s, they had these TV shows that were variety shows like Carol Burnett. And they had these people on there that would take these sticks and they would spin dishes on them. And I had one of those. I had the toy version of that, and I'm like, "Oh, I guess I did spin things." You know? So you have these little aha moments that, like, pop up where you're like, "Oh, yeah, I did do that." And so when there's not an estrangement, and there's a lot of estrangement in our community, but when there's not an estrangement and when family is involved, it can sometimes be helpful to look at that early childhood expression of yourself before you started filtering and dimming your light for other people. Like, I was naked all the time, all the time as a baby, and they just thought I was a happy naked baby, and it was the clothing, right? And so having a family member able to report you were naked all the time gave me diagnostic information to report back, right? Um, and I think too, the other thing that can be challenging is when it's a neurodivergent family, what other people outside the family might find as autistic behavior, a neurodivergent family might find it to be business as usual, you know? And so sometimes family members can't be as helpful because they don't have the neuromajority perception of normalcy, right? But I think that's how a lot of parents get diagnosed is they start asking these screening questions like, "Does your child have any issues with food?" Well, yeah, but so do I. And then you see the parents' light bulb go off, and that's kind of like, even though Patrick's expression of autism is extremely different than mine, that baseline of sensory issues, communication issues, my issue is people presume I communicate more effectively than I really do. His issue is people don't think he can communicate. But the communication barrier is still a problem for both of us. You know what I'm saying? So, the baseline is there, the expression, the intensity of need, the intensity of support services, that's what varies.
And, you described this very real fact that autism varies in presentation, what point of the life that it becomes more apparent, what are the stressors that may make certain challenges more challenging. And what are your thoughts on how the autism community at large is currently navigating the many differences? You know, people will refer to the autism wars, but what's your experience of what's going on, and where do you think the opportunity is to start shifting that infighting?
Well, I have not heard an autistic person in any form of leadership that expresses their autism like I do not talk about how massively underserved the population is across the board. People hear me say this all the time, and I'm just going to repeat it until it makes sense to someone. But, you know, I could really, really benefit from 10 hours a month of in home support services for basic housekeeping. It's not that I can't do it. It's that the shifting of attention and the multitasking and the physical demand for someone with a hypermobility disorder is so intense that when I weigh the benefit from the cost, it's not worth it. So I could really benefit from like 5 hours a month of housekeeping support. That's all I need. Um, but I'm not going to be eligible for that because now I make a living. So now I'm supposed to pay for that service. Now, at my income level, I can do that, but I'm thinking about someone who has been on Social Security disability and they step into a $30,000 or $40,000 a year job, which cannot allow you to pay for the services you need. And so we need to get rid of this illusion that if you do leave Social Security and become gainfully employed, you're not entitled to anything else. In order to sustain that employment, we need that in-home support as well, right? My son, on the other hand, needs to get out in the community. He needs to socialize. He needs quality employment training services. We've not yet found those. He needs an opportunity. Employers don't know how to do that yet. So, if I were the queen of everything and he could have what he needed, he would have at least 10 hours a week of community-based activity that would expand his skill set to make him start leaning more into employment. Um, the other challenge, though, is transportation for him. The fact that he's not verbally expressive leaves people believing that he's less capable than he is. And we just can't seem to break through that bias that he's experiencing. Just a handful of people in his life have seen through that. His teachers in high school saw through that. They saw his capacity. Um, and then there are people who need, 30, 40 hours a month. There are people who need 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I don't believe that the people who need 24 hours a day, 7 days a week are getting what they need. We're not paying direct support personnel enough money to keep them so they don't get the continuity of care they need. We are not training them effectively. We're still using old approaches to inclusive practices and trying to basically force them into a normative approach as compared to adapting it for the individual. The example I give is that I have memory processing issues. So my whole life, I was accused and referred to as being disorganized because the systems that my family taught me involved putting things away. And when you put it away and you have a memory problem, it ceases to exist for all time. So, it was sabotaging me in being successful. Now that I've integrated my diagnosis and I know about my memory problem and I had a word to Google to find supports for it, I've been able to adapt my work environment, my home environment, my lifestyle to consider that. And as a result, I'm highly organized now. But my organizational system doesn't look anything like my daughter's, who's very put away, or my husband, who's very put away. And so, what it comes down to is, I think we're being distracted by arguments over language, arguments over projected lack of support, lack of representation, when I think the one thing we could all agree on is that we need better policies and procedures, more transparency, more of a living wage as compared to us being subjected to living below the poverty line if we're on Social Security. more day programs that are meaningful, not group cattle calls. Like there are so many things we can agree on. I think that we're allowing ourselves to be baited by sensationalized, non-existent arguments. Like I said, no one who presents like me would believe that somebody who needs 24-hour service is getting the quality of care they need. They're not. We agree. We would like to stand elbow to elbow with you and campaign for that to get improved. But will you stand with me to make sure that the lighting in the room I want to work in doesn't make me cry for a whole day? Will you stand side by side with me to make sure that my son can have access to employment and that he can have someone help him with maintaining his home, even if he gets a job? You know, those are the things I think we should be working on. And it's a time of sensationalization. And I think we need to stop taking the bait.
And that's part of my goal with this podcast. I'm not autistic. I am very curious about so many different things all the time, but my goal is have everyone come on here and share what they know, share what is true for them, share what they've learned, because the algorithm will find exactly what you're already thinking and give you more of that. And my goal is like, no, let's break out of the algorithm and present as much as possible so that, like you were saying before, find out what is autism and what part resonates with you, and then move on accordingly. So you mentioned this need for better policies and transparency, and I know you wanted to discuss the IACC and just what you see is the potential and what you see the kind of obstacles that are manifesting right now.
Well, thanks for giving me a chance to verbalize this out loud because I'm working on a response and I don't have it finalized yet. But you know, I spent a considerable amount of personal time, effort, and money um, attending IAC meetings for over 10 years as a community member. I would just go sit in the audience and I would watch the dynamic of the meeting. I'd watch how the rhythm went. I'd watch how people communicated to one another. I really learned the culture of that environment because I was very aspirational about wanting to be there. I did give public testimony a couple of times before I joined. One testimony was, I think, incredibly influential because no one had been talking at the IAC about girls and women or about suicide. And although I'm not an expert at either of those, I brought both of those topics in as a public member, and it turned into a huge conversation around those topics. And I'm very proud of that. And then, you know, the last year of my dissertation, I was appointed to the committee. And I was just so humbled to be selected. I feel that I carry so many hats between being a person with lived experience, being a parent of someone who had inordinately high support needs early on in life. Um, he does go outside the frame in terms of accomplishing all he has, and I think that's an interesting lived experience to bring to the table. I've run a private practice where I provided direct support services to these families for over 10 years. And I've had a lot of leadership positions. So I really feel that I had earned my place there. And I think my more moderate take on things would have been a welcome voice on the committee. And I feel really good about the work we did for the year I was there. And then COVID came and we got, you know, very distanced during COVID because we were doing everything virtually. And a lot of the things that happen in DC happen in the hallways during the breaks. And so, you know, when you do virtual, you lose that. You lose those spaces of informal dialogue and conversation. And I think that was harmful. But then we just got disconnected. We got unplugged and everything stopped after my first year. And now it appears the usual process for choosing the members of the IAC was bypassed. They've already had a meeting behind closed doors. And sunshine laws would say that as a federal committee, they're supposed to be meeting in public. The people were hand-selected by a third party. Even the chair of the committee has said, "I don't know why I got appointed." The people who are there represent what, in my opinion, are some very dated points of view on autism. And again, they're being they're distracting us from the real work, which is policy. They're focused on cause and cure and vaccines, and all of that has been put to bed many times. Um, and so and we went from, oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember. We had 7 members on the committee who were autistic, 1 with intellectual disability, 1 who was non-speaking. It was the most diverse representation we'd had on the committee. Um, People with high support needs, their needs were being addressed. There were a lot of people at that table talking about the lack of supports and services and continuity of care for that part of the population. I was very hopeful that we were going to continue to make progress, because we were so diverse. And many of us were people like me who went on to get a PhD because they had a child with autism. And so we had all of these people who were wearing multiple hats that really brought a lot to the table. And unfortunately, I think we've really lost a lot in this iteration. And several of us had only been permitted to serve a single term when we were eligible for 2. And we know that we reapply at the end of a year and we may or may not be selected, but it wiped out the representation as we knew it. And so it's been very disappointing. I think it's a setback. I think that our progress is going to be minimized. And it's just sad. It's just sad because I think that we're going to see funding reallocated to things that have already been put to bed. And that means people are going to suffer. People are going to suffer. We've already seen situations where caregivers have been removed from the people they love, and their loved ones have died because the caregiver was taken away. It's just unacceptable. And so I don't know. I hold out hope that the agencies that are still part of the committee will continue to try to progress our research agenda. So we are continuing to do the meaningful work we've been doing. But I think it's going to kind of be a hiatus for a while. So that's my take.
And you mentioned this refocusing on things that have been put to rest. And there's, there's 2 elements that I've started to pay attention to. One is the genetics, where studying the genetics doesn't actually give you any information about what to do for the person. And I see this in medicine a lot. We're looking at a cause, but that's not what's going to make an impact on the people's lives.
It will have an effect on people's lives because if they can figure out how to stop those genetics, they will. We've already seen it in the Down syndrome community. That legacy haunts the autism community and people with intellectual disability who are not unhappy with their lives. They have good quality lives. If they don't, that's a reflection of our society, not the individual's disability.
And
I do believe, first of all, about genetics, that we're calling a lot of genetic conditions autism that are not. So, right? So, from that point of view, I think being able to delineate a deletion of chromosome XYZ that's resulting in intellectual disability, perfect sense, makes perfect sense. I do believe that the research dollars spent should be reflective of the frequency of those appearances. So, for example, for many decades that I followed the IAC, all of the money went to the people who were subjectively, observably highest support needs. But the reality of it is, if you get an autism diagnosis at 3, 6, 14, 40, it was there when you were a child too. We just didn't know how to find it. We didn't know how to see it. And so now what we're having to do is talk about the interplay between autism and diagnostic trauma. And that's a whole thing that needs to be unpacked. Why wouldn't we, as a community as a whole, at all support level needs, not be willing and interested in talking about the implications of trauma on autism? Everybody experiences it, right? That's a great example of something we should be able to collaborate on. Why is the Social Security access system so incredibly opaque? Why can't we work on making it user friendly with plain language and iconography and accessibility? Why can't we all agree to work on that? And so, I think that the genetic research needs to be done, but I don't think that more than 25 or 30% of the funding should go to that. I think the majority of the funding should follow the people with the majority of the challenges, especially those of us who have autism and all these other co occurring things. Like, we don't even know if, for example, the high rate of gastrointestinal issues is inherent to the syndromic nature of autism or whether it's caused by the inordinate level of trauma we continue to endure on a daily basis. Like, to me, those are the things that are interesting in getting examined. And I also think that many of the students, and I think it can be threatening for a lot of parents who have done everything they know to do. These are well intended people, but I think a lot of parents bought into the harsher version of ABA. They did not provide access to communication in any form for many, many years, decades sometimes for individuals. And they're seeing the expression of frustration that any human being would experience if they couldn't communicate, especially if they can't communicate pain or suffering. And so, I mean, if I were the queen of education, we would be focusing on communication first, just like my friend Jordan Zimmerman's organization works on. We really need to give children early and ongoing access to sensory support, communication support, and early on using real-time language that describes what they're experiencing. You know, I'll never forget this. I went to lunch with a colleague of mine in Nashville, and her daughter had episodic behavioral issues. And we went to an Italian restaurant, and her daughter doesn't eat gluten. And I said, Sarah, I feel really bad that we're, having gluten for lunch. Do you feel bad that you're not getting to have gluten with us? And she goes, oh, no, Miss Dena, when I have gluten, I have behavior and it makes me unhappy. And I'm like, damn, that's what it's supposed to look like, right? She has language for what she's experiencing. She's been able, with the parent support, to connect. When I eat this, I feel these things, and I don't like the way these things feel. She's in her body. She owns her body. She hasn't repressed her body's needs. That's what we need to start doing. We need to stop asking kids to be robots. And by the way, that's not just autistic kids. The whole educational model is based on factories, so we need to just break that whole thing up. But I think you're right. I think that autistic kids and adults are the canary in the coal mines, as we used to say back in the day. We are the outward manifestation of a society that's too fast, too loud, too noisy, too demanding, um, too inflexible, doesn't elevate care and keeping and personal wellness above everything else. And so I think that there's a significant amount of things we could work on in agreement and in collaboration, elbow to elbow.
Thank you for that phrasing of it, because it's like, okay, fine, you have the genetic aspect, but so much of the funding needs to go on the everything else. I don't care how the brain is wired on imaging. I want to know, how does this kid feel in a social situation, and what are the tools that are accessible to this kid or to the parents to help support this kid? Like, how much of the research money can also go on ways to support parents, because they're the immediate environment for these kids. If you can help the parents shift their perspective and their view of the child and relationship with the child, does the child get better in whatever area you're focusing on?
I mean, like I said, we stumbled into it, but that's kind of how we raised this kid. Um, he didn't like that they didn't take turns at soccer, so we didn't go back to soccer. Therapeutic horseback riding gave him a lot of good sensory input. He had great rapport with the animals and with the people who worked there. It was really good for his body, to keep him in his body and not interoceptively check out, and then he did, the hockey team, and oh my gosh. Little boys grow up with females in their lives, right? Female teachers, moms are teaching them things. Boys don't do things in locker rooms that women do. They do things that are very different, and they still need that culture. They need to know how males operate in a locker room, and it's not appropriate for mom to be teaching that. And so I was really, really glad that he got to experience being immersed with his fellow hockey players, and then all their girlfriends kind of adopted him and kept an eye on him, and so he didn't experience any bullying in school. He didn't experience anything negative because if anybody, I understand there was an event, and I understand the hockey player took care of business, you know? And I mean, isn't that the baseline, right? Just having friends. Did they call him up to go to parties? No, they didn't call him up to go to parties. But you know what? They showed up for him at school, and he felt like he had friends. And that's the other thing I think it's hard for parents is, we want them to have the life we want for them. And it's very hard for us to pull back and let them just be themselves, however that's defined. We were in DC last week for a meeting, and actually he was piggybacking on my business trip because I needed to get him back here because I was going out of state. And so we went from Philly to DC. We did a museum that day. And then the next day he spent the whole day in the hotel room, just the room service and Netflix, right? And so I texted him about 4 o'clock and I said, I'm going to come back to the hotel and get you because there's a reception tonight and I'd like you to meet my friends. And I'm like, get a shower and get yourself cleaned up because I'm going to come back. So I brought him to the party. I went over with my friends. I introduced him to my friends. Then he went into a corner and sat in the corner and just watched people. Now, if I wasn't neuroaffirming in the way I parent, I would have been pushing him to come join the group. And instead, his way of participating was to sit in that corner and watch everybody else do what they do, you know? And I did bring him over a couple of times to show off his Legos and, to show off his room and his collections, which he enjoyed doing. And then he was done. He was happy to go back into the corner. Um, that makes me happy. He was happy and enjoying himself. He had to eat a hot dog that was overcooked. He survived, but he got to do the things he likes to do, and so I think that that's the goal. He's happy, well-adjusted, he's non-medicated, and I have to believe that it's because of the way that, we parented him. He's still got the anxiety. He's genetically wired to have significant co-occurring health issues, related to mental health, but he doesn't. And I think it's because we didn't force him to push through that. And I don't know, I think we got lucky. I got a great kid, and I think that that's wonderful. But I have a little survivor's guilt too. I know people who haven't been as fortunate or whose best intentions did actual harm, for their loved ones. And, you know, we can only hope for a healing and recovery from those kind of harms. So.
I want to touch on one other thing that you mentioned about your own experience and how, even though they may know that you're autistic, in those moments they're viewing your behavior as something like a personality flaw or some kind of a choice. And I wonder how much of your childhood or anybody that's late diagnosed is riddled with these moments, but expect instead of those people judging your behavior, you yourself are judging your behavior because you don't know that there's another explanation. And so it becomes like, oh, I guess I'm so sensitive, or oh, I can't do this. Like, how much of that has to be rewired for a person that then gets a diagnosis?
It's a lot. I always say you don't outgrow autism, you grow into it, especially for those of us who are late diagnosed. But I think, no matter how your autism is expressing, you still need to have words and language to understand that, whether it's spoken or non-spoken. Um, with verbal language, you have to be able to express what you need and what you want. Um, and we I don't know. I mean, all the years that I experienced sexual abuse at the hands of this family member, I thought everybody knew. Like, my theory of mind was so distorted that I thought it was apparent. And now looking back on it, I was just like some dystopian, depressed teenager. Like, that's what they saw. But I thought I was wearing an A. I thought it was very obvious what was happening. I remember the first time I wrote about it in my journal, and I was sure that it was just like emanating red ink and everyone could see it. As a child, you don't have that perspective taking ability. So, I would say that the need to, first of all, tease out what was a result of the abuse versus what was a result of undiagnosed autism, right? What was dissociation versus sensory shutdown? Like, all of that has to be therapeutically teased out. I do think that our therapeutic approaches tend to lean into helping people to become more normal instead of helping them to develop skills and strategies to be able to live well with autism. Masking's a great example of that. We keep telling people masking is a bad thing. And instead, we need to be saying masking is normal human behavior. Everybody masks. Who you are on your girls' night out, going to hot tub time machine is probably not who you reflect when you go to a job interview. And so the question is, how much of your cognitive rain barrel can you give to masking, and how much do you have to retain to be productive? I, for example, know I'm going to California and my speaking event is Friday afternoon. I'm actually leaving very late Wednesday night. I'm going to part of the activities on Thursday and then part of the activities on Friday, and then I'm leaving Saturday, so I'll have the weekend to recover. And all of that is very planned out. All of that is very much within my control. Back in the old days, I would have stayed in town as long as humanly possible. I would have forced myself to take a red eye, which would have decimated me. And when I got there, I wouldn't be as productive as I wanted to be. And then I'd feel guilty and despondent because it was not a good trip. You have to learn how to plan your life to consider autism. I do other things. I only cook one day a week. I cook a big vat of chili or spaghetti or soup on the weekend. So all I do the rest of the week is reheat. I have to do one load of laundry 4 days a week because I can't run the rest of my errands and do laundry on the weekend. Like, you learn how to plan accordingly. Whose job is it to teach us those skills? Nobody's teaching this. And I mean, again, I don't think it's just autistic people. I don't think we're teaching any high school kid how to manage their lives this way. They just fall and stumble and break and put themselves back together again. So I think we can do much better across the board.
And in terms of that, what would you, if you could be the queen of everything, I love that. what what does a path forward look like for unifying the autistic community and seeing the changes? Like what does that path forward look like?
I think it comes down to identifying key priorities, and the IAC was really close. We were so close to doing that, identifying mutually agreed upon priorities for policy and systems change. We need to create employment positions for systems navigators that can help people through these systems until they are more accessible and more usable. Parents need to be able to parent and teach independent living skills. Homework should be gone. These kids are already just exuding so much more energy than their peers to just make it through the day. We can't expect them to come home and do homework too. And the communication isn't good between school and home anyway. So let me work on haircuts and when he was little, toilet training and things like that while you work on teaching him to read, you know? Um, and then I think that we need to give a lot less airtime and mental energy to the sensationalism, and focus on getting back down to the grassroots needs and execute research that does that. I'm working on one research project that's learning, teaching people about autism who were mental health providers who never got any training on it. All of the work we do in our lab is using community advisory groups to inform our research and our work products to make sure that they represent the voices of the autistic community. Um, I think that's the other piece is engaging us in our own research. Um, I think it involves finding what we can agree on and then doubling down on that. And maybe putting the things we disagree about on a parking lot somewhere, not that it'll never be addressed, but, the way we've been doing it with this infighting, we've not made much progress. We're not hearing each other anymore at the table. And so we need to just find the places we agree and move from there.
I love that. I really love that perspective. And you have so much wisdom from all of the hats that you wear. Where can people find you, whether it's to collaborate or learn more about your work or work with you?
They can just Google my name at Drexel University. I have a page there and they can track me down there. I also have a Facebook page. She doesn't get enough attention right now because I'm a busy person, but it's called the Center for Understanding. And that page is where it's not a politically oriented page unless there's a direct implication for our community. Like I posted the IAC information, for example. But mostly it's places where people can go for information. There's a training that's going to be happening on palliative care for people with IDD out of Canada. I posted that last week. So I just try to use it as a place to share information so that people can continue on their own individual journey to integrating their diagnosis and really knowing cohesively who they are as an adult on the spectrum. So
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'll link to that in the show notes. And it was a real pleasure to have you on here. Thank you for sharing.
great talking to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you.